Get out and never come back. You are nothing to this family." My mother's voice ricocheted off the high, ornate ceilings of the historic brownstone I had been secretly financing for years. The sound was sharp enough to slice through plaster. Ethan stood just behind her shoulder, arms folded, the faintest curl of a smirk on his face, as if the $50,000 gambling debt trailing him wasn't suffocating the entire room. It hung there anyway, invisible but enormous, pressing against the crown molding and antique mirrors. I didn't plead, I didn't let my eyes water. I looked at Susan, really looked at her, then shifted my gaze to the brother whose existence I had been underwriting for the better part of a decade. "Understood," I said. My tone was level, stripped of warmth, stripped of hurt, clinical. I picked up my bag from the console table I had paid to restore, walked across the hardwood floors I had refinished, and pulled open the heavy oak door. The Chicago wind hit my face like a slap as I stepped outside. Behind me, the lock snapped into place with a decisive click. Final. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, the engine's low hum steady against the frozen Chicago night. My hands rested on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, unmoving, controlled. The brownstone's porch light cast a dull amber glow onto the fresh layer of snow, making everything look deceptively peaceful. I waited for the emotional collapse. I waited for the familiar wave of guilt, the instinct to run back inside and apologize for existing. But nothing surfaced. Instead, a cold settled into my chest that mirrored the temperature outside. It wasn't painful, it was clarifying. For 29 years, I had been navigating through a fog of duty and obligation. Now the fog lifted, and the math was undeniable. I wasn't a daughter being disowned. I was a service provider whose contract had been abruptly terminated. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The glow illuminated the dark interior of the car. I bypassed my messages, ignored my contacts, and opened my banking app without hesitation. The interface loaded, displaying the architecture of my financial life: checking, savings, investments. Then the tab that mattered: scheduled transfers. There it was, the quiet engine behind my family's illusion of stability. Family support, $3,850, scheduled for the first of every month. I stared at the number. $3,850 wasn't just a mortgage contribution, it was a premium membership fee to a club that had just revoked my access. For years, I had structured my budget around the absence of that money. I worked 60-hour weeks optimizing global supply chains, eliminating inefficiencies for corporations worth billions, yet I had tolerated this glaring deficit in my own ledger. My mother's words echoed again: "Get out." In logistics, when a client refuses delivery, you don't force the shipment, you reroute, you cut the loss. They had made their directive clear. If they wanted me removed from their lives, then my capital would exit as well. You cannot evict the tenant and still expect the rent. I tapped the recurring transfer. The details expanded on screen. Next payment, 4 days away. I selected Edit, then Cancel Series. A gray warning box appeared, politely asking if I was certain I wanted to delete this transaction. My thumb hovered, not from doubt, but from recognition. This single confirmation would alter the financial ecosystem of that house more than any argument ever could. Confirm. The line item disappeared instantly, my projected balance recalculated, rising by nearly $4,000 for the following month. The visual was almost jarring. That capital would no longer sustain the brownstone's illusion. It would no longer subsidize Susan's curated dinner parties or Ethan's crisis management. It would remain with me. I sent no explanation, no dramatic text, no manifesto. Emotion invites negotiation. I wasn't negotiating. I was finalizing severance. I set the phone face down, shifted into drive, and pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the brownstone shrank into shadow. The transaction was complete. I checked into a downtown hotel, a minimalist high-rise with neutral carpets and blackout curtains that sealed the world out. I didn't unpack. I opened my laptop instead. Decisions in my world were driven by data, and the data of my personal life resembled a forensic audit. My annual salary as a senior logistics manager was $145,000. I managed supply chains for critical medical equipment. I mitigated multi-million-dollar disruptions before breakfast, yet my own living conditions suggested scarcity. I had been residing in a cramped 400-square-foot studio with secondhand furniture and drafty windows. I drove a modest sedan, I clipped coupons, I rationed indulgences. Why? Because for 4 consecutive years, I had been the sole liquidity source for the Evans brownstone. The property itself was less a home, more a performance venue. Susan and Thomas didn't inhabit it, they staged it. They hosted elaborate dinners they couldn't afford for guests they privately criticized. Ethan occupied the garden suite, a flattering term for a finished basement, where he brainstormed startups that dissolved before generating revenue. 33 years old, calling himself an entrepreneur, printing business cards for ventures without tax IDs or functioning websites. One year he attempted cryptocurrency mining, tripling the electric bill I absorbed. Another year it was luxury drop shipping, resulting in a garage filled with unsold merchandise that I financed the removal of. My parents interpreted these failures as evidence of misunderstood brilliance. To them, Ethan was a volatile stock poised for explosive growth. I was the dependable bond, stable and predictable, there to absorb the shocks. People simplify my compliance as weakness. That's inaccurate. In systems analysis, we call it legacy integration. When you're raised inside a malfunctioning structure, you mistake dysfunction for design. They didn't demand thousands overnight. It began subtly. At 10, I was fetching wine because Susan was overwhelmed. At 16, I was buying my own clothes because Thomas had temporary cash flow issues. Over time, the conditioning solidified. My worth equated to utility. If I provided, I was valued. If I solved problems, I was secure. Love in that house was not unconditional. It was transactional. I was the one reconciling the accounts. I had normalized the imbalance, convinced myself that being the fuel that kept Ethan afloat was simply my role. But eventually, even renewable resources deplete. The frog doesn't just leak from boiling water. Sometimes it dismantles the heating system entirely. I studied the spreadsheet on my screen. For the first time in 48 months, the silent investor column read 0. I wasn't merely saving money, I was reclaiming agency. They wanted to preserve the brownstone's facade. They wanted their illusion of prosperity, but they ignored the fundamental rule of sustainability. You do not terminate the sole revenue stream and expect operations to continue uninterrupted. I closed the laptop. The quiet in the hotel room cost $200 a night. It was the first discretionary expense I had allowed myself in years, and it felt justified. Ethan, at 33, had devoted his adult life to speculative ventures. While I earned certifications and negotiated international contracts, he incubated ideas in the basement. His most recent disaster involved online gambling disguised as strategic investment. The $50,000 deficit wasn't theoretical, it was immediate. Susan had presented the demand calmly, almost casually. "You have the funds, Vanessa. Resolve this for your brother." For the first time, I assessed the request like any other proposal. The return on investment was non-existent. The risk? Infinite. "No," I said. "Bailouts are reserved for distressed assets with viable recovery paths, not financial sinkholes." The shouting escalated instantly. My refusal destabilized their entire operating model. If I wasn't functioning as the bank, then I had no place in the vault. They expelled me, confident that exile would trigger compliance. They misjudged my tolerance for loss. 30 days passed. I transitioned from the hotel into a one-bedroom apartment in a glass high-rise 3 miles south. It was modern and efficient, devoid of antique expectations. I furnished it with clean lines and neutral tones. I bought a $300 coffee maker without justification or guilt. Each morning, I looked out over Lake Michigan and waited for the inevitable phone call. None came. 5 days, 10, 20. The silence wasn't confusing, it was strategic. They assumed inertia would prevail. They believed the autopay was still intact, that my need for approval outweighed my pride. They were sitting comfortably in their historic property, expecting the first of the month to arrive like clockwork. They did not realize the funding source had already been severed. I wasn't hiding, I was observing, waiting for the system to register the disruption. Day 45. In mortgage logistics, that's when delinquency transitions from oversight to crisis. 15 days of grace, then reminders, then formal notices, and by day 45, the status changes and the calls begin. I knew the timeline better than I knew my own birthday, because I had spent 4 years ensuring we never hit that marker. But this morning, I was sitting in my office reviewing a shipping manifest for MRI machines when my personal phone lit up. It was Thomas. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring 4 times, finishing my email. When I finally swiped, except there was no hello, there was only the sound of a man who had lost control of his narrative. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice cracked high and thin. "The bank just called. The mortgage bounced. They're saying we're delinquent. You're trying to ruin us, Vanessa. You're trying to destroy this family." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the city skyline. "I didn't do anything, Thomas," I said, my voice steady. "I simply stopped paying for a house I was evicted from. You told me to leave. I left. My money left with me." "That was a heat-of-the-moment thing," he shouted. "We were fighting. Families fight. But you have a duty. You have an obligation. You can't just cut off the mortgage. That money is for the estate. It's for the legacy." He was gaslighting me in real time, trying to separate the abuse from the bill. He genuinely believed that my eviction was an emotional event, but my financial contribution was a contractual obligation that survived the termination of the relationship. Listening to him panic, I finally understood the mechanism at work. It wasn't just favoritism, it was economics, specifically the sunk cost fallacy. In business, the sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue throwing good money after bad because you have already invested so much that you cannot bear to admit the loss. My parents had spent 33 years investing in Ethan. They had poured their ego, their identity, and their reputation into the idea that their son was a genius entrepreneur. To hold him accountable now, to demand he get a job or pay rent, would be to admit that their entire investment strategy was a failure. It would destroy their own self-image. They couldn't fold the hand on Ethan, so they needed me to be the liquidity injection. I was the fresh capital keeping a bankrupt venture afloat. They weren't protecting him because they loved him more. They were protecting him because admitting he was a liability would mean admitting they were bad investors. They would rather burn me, the profitable asset, than admit the golden child was a loss. "I am not your legacy insurance," I said into the phone, "and I am not paying for a house where I am not welcome. If you need money, ask the person living in the garden suite." "Ethan is building something," Thomas sputtered. "He just needs time. You are selfish, Vanessa. You are cold. If we lose this house, it is on your head." "No," I corrected. "It's on the deed, which doesn't have my name on it." I hung up. It was filled with the realization that they would truly rather lose everything than ask their son to pay a single dollar. They were committed to the crash. I didn't scream back. I didn't try to outshout a man who was drowning in his own panic. In my world, when a vendor fails to deliver, you don't argue with the sales rep, you audit the books. I told Thomas I would look into the account history, and I hung up. My voice was calm, the kind of calm that precedes a massive corporate restructuring. I opened my laptop. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment. This was the point of no return. I logged into the joint checking account, the operational account I had funded for 4 years. I still had the login credentials, a remnant of the days when I was expected to troubleshoot their technical issues because they weren't good with computers. The dashboard loaded. The balance was $200. I pulled up the transaction history for the last 10 months. I needed to trace the flow of capital. I knew my output, $4,500 a month. That was the agreed-upon sum. $3,850 for the mortgage, plus a surplus for property taxes and maintenance. It was a generous operating budget. The mortgage should have been on autopay. The math should have been simple, but the ledger told a different story. I filtered the search. The mortgage payments had been sporadic for a year, then stopped 10 months ago. But I had kept sending the money. So where did $45,000 go? It hadn't evaporated. Money never disappears. It just changes hands. I scrolled through the withdrawals, looking for the leak. I found it. It wasn't a leak, it was a fire hose. Starting 10 months ago, there were recurring transfers to Ethan Evans. 500 here, 1,000 there, but those were small potatoes compared to the line item that made my blood run cold. A massive down payment of $12,000 to Lakeshore Luxury Auto, followed by monthly payments of $900. I clicked on the check image for the down payment. In the memo line, in my father's shaky handwriting, were the words, "Company Vehicle Investment." I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, dark and jagged. It wasn't a company vehicle. Ethan didn't have a company. He didn't have clients. He didn't have a commute. I did a quick search on the dealership's inventory and cross-referenced the payment amount. It matched the financing terms for a fully loaded obsidian black luxury pickup truck, a $65,000 toy for a man who lived in a basement. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just mismanaged the money. They hadn't just fallen behind because groceries were expensive. Thomas had taken the money I sent to save their home, the money I earned working 60-hour weeks, and he had diverted it to buy Ethan a status symbol. He had embezzled the mortgage payments to fund his son's cosplay as a successful businessman. They deemed the truck more essential than the roof over their heads. They gambled that I would never check the books, or that if I did, I would simply pay off the mortgage anyway to avoid the shame of foreclosure. They had stripped the equity from their own future to polish the ego of their golden child. This wasn't negligence, this was theft, and I had the receipts. The foreclosure notice arrived at the brownstone exactly 30 days after my audit. I know this because the bank also sent a copy to my old email address, a courtesy for the former financial contact. It was a formal eviction warning. They had 30 days to vacate. The legacy they claimed to protect was being liquidated. I didn't call to gloat. I didn't call to offer a lifeline. I just waited. 3 days later, security at my office building called my desk. "Miss Evans, there are 2 individuals in the lobby asking for you. They say they're your parents. They're upset." I told the guard to let them wait. I finished my coffee, I reviewed a contract for a shipment of surgical steel, then I took the elevator down. The lobby of my building is a cavern of marble and glass, designed to make visitors feel small. Susan and Thomas looked microscopic. They were huddled on a leather bench, looking older than I had ever seen them. Susan was weeping into a tissue. Thomas was pale, his hands shaking in his lap. They weren't the imperious landlords who had screamed at me to get out. They were refugees of their own financial disaster. When they saw me, they scrambled up. Susan tried to rush forward, arms open, aiming for a hug that would erase the last 2 months. I stepped back, professional distance. "Vanessa," she sobbed, "thank God, you have to help us. We're losing the legacy. We're losing the brownstone. We can't let strangers take our home." Thomas added, his voice trembling, "For the sake of the family, for your brother, please just pay the arrears. We'll make it right." They were still doing it. Even at the edge of the cliff, they were asking me to be the parachute for Ethan. They weren't sorry, they were just broke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture them about responsibility. I simply opened the manila folder I had brought down with me. "You aren't losing the house because of me," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet lobby, "and you aren't losing it because of bad luck." I handed Thomas the paper. It wasn't a check. It was a printout of the transaction history I had uncovered. Highlighted in neon yellow was the wire transfer to Lakeshore Luxury Auto, $65,000, the exact amount of equity they needed to save their home, sitting on 4 rubber tires in the driveway. "You embezzled my mortgage payments," I said. "You took the money I sent to keep a roof over your heads, and you bought Ethan a truck for a business that doesn't exist. You didn't prioritize the legacy, you prioritized his ego." Thomas stared at the paper. His face turned a shade of gray that matched the stone floor. Susan stopped crying and froze. They looked at the evidence of their own theft, stripped of all the family rhetoric they used to hide it. "I can't save you," I said, stepping back toward the security gates, "because I don't have that money anymore. Ethan has it. Maybe he can sell the truck." "Vanessa, wait," Susan wailed, realizing the meeting was over. I turned back one last time. "You told me to get out. I did. Now you have to get out too." I swiped my badge. The glass gates opened. I walked through them and didn't look back. The foreclosure auction took place 90 days after I walked out of the lobby. I didn't attend. I didn't need to see the gavel fall to know the asset had been liquidated. The brownstones sold for just enough to cover the bank's lien and the outstanding tax bill. There was no equity left over. My parents moved into a 2-bedroom rental apartment in a suburb 45 minutes away. It has low ceilings, laminate countertops, and thin walls. They hate it. Ethan's luxury truck was repossessed 3 weeks later. Without the embezzled funds from the mortgage account, he couldn't make a single payment. He is back to taking the bus. The CEO is now working part-time at a warehouse, a job Thomas forced him to take to pay their new rent. The reality check was brutal, but it was necessary. I haven't spoken to them since that day in the lobby. I blocked their numbers, their emails, and their social media accounts. I didn't do it to punish them. I did it to protect the new ecosystem I was building. There is a misconception about going no contact. People tell you it is an act of war. They tell you that you are cold, that you are unforgiving, that family is the most important asset you possess. But they are wrong. Family is a system, and sometimes that system is designed to consume you. If you are standing on that edge right now, wondering if you are too harsh for walking away, listen to me. You aren't losing a family, you are surviving one. You aren't abandoning them, you are saving yourself. The guilt you feel is just the programming they installed to keep you compliant. It is the error code they wrote into your software to stop you from uninstalling the malware. Peace is expensive. It cost me a historic home. It cost me the illusion of having parents who loved me. It cost me the comfort of the familiar. But as I sit here in my own apartment, drinking coffee that I paid for, looking out at a view that belongs only to me, I look at the balance sheet of my life. I have silence. I have dignity. I have a future that isn't being mortgaged to pay for someone else's mistakes. Peace is expensive, but looking at the ledger now, I can tell you this: it is worth every single penny. If you've ever had to pay the price for your own peace, share this story. You aren't alone.